All right, share my screen. All right, friends. Today we get into material that will most likely change your life. Okay, this is essentially the pathophysiology of concussion. Okay, so here's the deal, right? This, when we talk about the pathophysiology of concussion, this really is. This is kind of a difficult area, because this is the foundation for everything that we know about this injury, at least the mechanics, the mechanism, how it happens, right? But at the same time, it's the thing that we know the least about. This is still the biggest puzzle piece, of all the pieces, hello roommates, of all the proverbial puzzle pieces within concussion, right? So this is by and large one of the most difficult pieces of this puzzle. Okay, but guys, as we talked about, right, and as all of you know already to a certain extent, right, so a concussion obviously takes place after any impact of the head, face, or body, right, and that blow gets transmitted from the body, right, through the head and creates an impulsive force. Now, at the moment of head acceleration, okay, so if I get hit and my head accelerates forward, okay, the second my head accelerates forward, I essentially have my first impact, which is my coup mechanic, right? So my first impact, the impact at the moment of acceleration, okay, that's coup mechanics. And then after the impact, when my head decelerates rapidly, all right, the brain strikes the opposite wall of the skull, okay, that is a contra coup mechanic. So coup, okay, impact during the acceleration phase, contra coup, impact during the deceleration phase of the impact, okay? Okay, cool. Here's the deal though, right? So coup contra coup was essentially an area, I'm super proud of this picture, by the way. Yeah, super aesthetically pleasing. Pretty colors. So ultimately, right, coup contra coup mechanics though was how we used to think about these impacts, at least at first, okay? But here's the deal, okay? That has actually begun to evolve and change. And we've actually begun to essentially realize and recognize that the combination of those mechanics are not only obviously anterior posterior, so linear forces, but also rotational forces, okay? So forces that actually cause the brain to rotate inside of the skull. Who can give me an example, by the way? Who can give me an example of forces in the brain, or maybe an impact of some sort that may produce a rotational force versus one that might produce an anterior, posterior, or linear force? Give me some examples.
So an anterior. Go ahead, Josh.
Oh, okay. I think kind of like the classic linear one would just kind of be like a head-on collision, and like a sport like rugby or football or basketball, or first thing that comes like rotational to my mind is kind of like in a sport like boxing or MMA. When someone gets punched, that's kind of what I think of.
Okay,
if I'm understanding correctly.
Right, absolutely. So, and Nico, what were you going to say, buddy?
I was going to say like someone like smacking their head on like a wall or a floor or something like that for linear.
Absolutely. Okay, yeah, and so when we have these rotational forces, guys, ultimately, you can imagine like with a punch to the face, like in a boxing match, causes obviously a rotational moment of the head in a very, very quick fashion, right? Conversely, getting elbowed in the head during a basketball game or what have you, right? Any impact from the side has obviously the potential to cause a rapid rotational force, right? Now, what happens though when these forces happen, right? So it's not just that, we have a force, right? And that causes the brain to strike the skull in different ways. Obviously, the brain is also made up of neurons and nerve fibers. And when, for example, and the brain itself, remember, is not a solid object, right? Inside of the skull, it actually is an object that undergoes essentially plastic deformations, right? So the brain has been known to obviously deform, right, when it hits the wall of the skull. So when that brain essentially deforms, it compresses and also can stretch. So if a neuron can compress and stretch, the fibers in that neuron and the neuron itself can be stretched and potentially broken as well. Okay. So when that neuron breaks, right? Anything, and maybe even potentially when a nerve fiber within a neuron tears, which can happen, right? That was essentially results in an inflammatory response. Just like any other injury that we have that we see in athletic training practice, this also results in an inflammatory response, okay? Now, here's the difficulty though. Unlike an ankle sprain, unlike an ACL injury, right? This is not an inflammatory response that we can directly appreciate and see. And it's not one that we can actually directly even treat, okay? Which makes it very difficult. So as a result of that, as a result of the stretching and tearing of those neuronal fibers, right? Inflammatory markers and chemical mediators flood the neuron, right? And I'm going to show you guys some slides here that explain this in further detail. Right? So what do we call this flood, right, of inflammatory markers and chemicals, right? It's been referred to in the literature as the neurometabolic cascade of concussion, okay? The neurometabolic cascade of concussion. And this was first described by Christopher Giza. He's a neurosurgeon in California. And he did a lot of early work with a lot of the pioneers of concussion, particularly within athletic training, Kevin Guskowitz and others. And he's the one that essentially kind of coined this terminology, right? So obviously, though, one thing that we've also learned since this neurometabolic cascade was first identified back in like 2000, in the late 90s, early 2000s, was that ultimately we've also been able to appreciate on functional MRI actually blood flow changes in the brain after injury, right? We're actually able to actually demonstrate that now on functional MRI. Okay, here's the deal. You guys remember me telling you yesterday that we don't routinely image, right, these concussions, and that's still true. Clinically, it's still true, right? Because ultimately, the benefit to the patient of imaging these injuries is low. There's really no clinical benefit for the patient. These imaging studies, like diffusion tensor imaging (DTI), and also functional MRI, are used more in research contexts to identify anatomical, markers of damage, right? And also physiologic changes after concussion. So these types of imaging studies are typically used in research and not really so much in clinical practice. Okay, so here's the deal, right? Let's take a look at the top picture here. So we can see over here on the far left, we've got some nerve fibers. We can actually kind of see the thalamus here, and nerve fibers extending up into the cerebrum from the thalamus. We can see kind of in a normal brain how those fibers look to be very intact, and they're continuous all throughout that arch on the left, right, ascending from the thalamus all the way up to the cortex. Okay, but we can see in someone potentially with head trauma, presumably even concussion, that the continuity of those fibers, right, from anterior to posterior has been interrupted, right? And you can see that in this slide. Okay, conversely, the other thing that you may notice too on this picture on the right is that the width, right, and integrity of their neuronal fibers here in this picture is much thinner, right? And they appear to be a bit more brittle on the right as opposed to the left-hand side. Okay, if we come down to the bottom picture here, okay, this is actually an example of functional MRI. Okay, and what we can see here at the top picture, right, is we can see essentially a normally distributed, essentially blood flow and hemodynamics in a healthy brain. Question for you guys: and just from what we know, the basics that we've learned about brain function and neurology, what do you notice about this brain, this healthy control brain? So the red that we see here is blood flow. What do you notice about this healthy control and the way that this is actually kind of distributed within the brain? Why would this make sense in a healthy person? Who can tell me why?
Is it because trying to think how to word it. Basically because of like, dang it, I lost my thought.
You're okay. You're okay. Take your time. If you remember it, Josh, jump back in. Okay, don't worry about it. Any other thoughts as to why this looks the way it does? Okay, so you guys remember, right? Where does the vast majority of our cognitive function, particularly that of our interpretive function, typically take place? What's the highest level of function within the brain? Typically occurs where?
Would that be the frontal lobe?
Okay, frontal lobe, specifically though, and Josh, you're correct, specifically though, in the cortex, because remember, within the brain itself, what actually resides in the cortex? That's where our brain matter, remember, where a lot of our cell bodies are, right? And that's where a lot of, obviously, communication, right? Higher level motor function, look, so prefrontal, postfrontal gyrus, right? All of those things, remember that, okay? We can see, and it would make sense to us then, how the blood flow within those areas within a normal brain would be distributed there, okay? Because that's where the most cognitive is, right? For all of us throughout the day, right? Interpreting the world around us, moving, responding, right? And planning, okay? Okay, now, conversely, okay, let's look at actually at this brain that essentially we have experienced a concussion. Notice the not only the increase in blood flow, but how widely this gets distributed right throughout the brain. Obviously, much more here is actually distributed not only throughout the parietal lobe, but also within the most anterior portion of the occipital lobe and the cerebellum. It's really interesting. Whereas in this picture here at the top, within the normal brain, we don't really see that as much, right? But here in the cerebellum, we definitely do, right? Increased blood flow to the frontal cortex, right? As well. Okay, so the brain is essentially attempting to show more blood to the area to ultimately increase oxygen uptake in the event of injury. Okay, the other thing that we're also seeing here within a concussed brain is, obviously also more blood flow to not only the midbrain, but also the lower brain centers that control primitive function, balance, okay, and also autonomic function. Okay, all right. Here's the deal, guys. What on a chemical level, what happens? Okay, we have those linear and rotational forces that cause the brain to shift inside of the skull. The neurons obviously stretch and shear, some neurofibers tear, okay? But what happens here, okay, chemically? Ultimately, one of the first things that happens, okay, when we have this neuronal stretch, right, and injury, is that we have the influx of a chemical, right, called glutamate, right? And ultimately what happens is the glutamate increases the hyperexcitability of the neuron. And in order to reestablish homeostasis after injury, these ATP activated pumps, right, turn on and they start working super hard, pump, 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 to try to kind of get energy into the cell. But when that happens, right, that ATP is brought into the cell, undergoes its normal metabolic process, and is broken down into ADP. Okay, we all know that, ATP to ADP, right, from exphys. Now, here's the deal. It undergoes that normal metabolic process, but that metabolic process is not downregulated. It just keeps going, all right? As a result, okay, we have this massive outflow of potassium and a massive inflow of calcium into the cell, all right? What that essentially creates is a toxic environment that creates inflammation within the neuron itself, okay? And that leads to, not only obviously symptoms, but can also lead to, neuronal breakdown and death, okay? All right, so, and guys, I know this is rather technical, but we're gonna but this is stuff you need to know. So here we go. So you can see.
Wait, I have a quick question.
Sir, go ahead.
So going back to the previous slide, basically, if I'm trying to piece it together, is
Yep.
basically what you're saying is basically like the neuron and the receptors are getting all gunked up, and that basically is what is causing the symptoms.
So the injury, right? So ultimately, right, it's multifactorial. So the neuron stretches and shears, and stretches and maybe even tears some, right? But because of that injury, so you got to think back to modalities for a second. I'm just going to kind of give you a little bit of a parallel to think, a way to think about this. So you guys remember the difference between primary and secondary injury and modalities? What's the difference between primary and secondary injury?
Well, primary is like the initial, I twisted my ankle and I tore a tendon. But the secondary is basically because I tore that tendon and everything else, like the inflammatory process that's coming in, other cells get to be damaged or die because of it.
Okay. Okay. So Josh, here's the deal. So if we break this down into both a primary and secondary injury, the primary injury is the stretching and shearing of the neuron that occurs because of the biomechanical force. Okay. As a result, the inflow of glutamate, the increased metabolic demand, okay, and the influx of calcium ions and the outflow of potassium ions causes a toxic environment that we liken to secondary cell death. Right, so that's the secondary cell death after concussion. Does that make sense? Cool. Yeah, I see the light bulb coming on. So sorry for not explaining it that way earlier, but that's actually I think that's a really productive way to explain that, so that it makes sense. Cool. All right. Cool. All right. Okay, guys. Here's the deal. So, like we talked about. Okay, what in the world happens here? When we have this initial injury. Obviously, we have that primary injury, okay, that acute injury, that neuronal stretch shear, right? And ultimately, as you can imagine, that neuronal stretch and shear actually damages the cytoskeleton and the axon, right? Like any other nerve fiber in the body, right? And so ultimately, we have this glutamate influx essentially right after the injury, which increases excitability of the neuron, right? And that sets off, an increased level of glucose and metabolic demand, right? And you can actually see as well a spike in the level of potassium and an inflow of calcium over time, at least in this graph over a period of 4 days. So here's the thing. Look at what happens to glucose though after about day 1. Okay, you see how my glucose level here actually tends to spike within the first several hours after injury, but then right after that, you see how the glucose level tends to just drop off after day 1. And oops, sorry, gosh dang it, I can't draw. Clear. You see how that level tends to just kind of spike and then drop off after about day 1, and then stays low through about day 7 nearly. Okay, so ultimately now we have this decreased glucose level and essentially this increase in demand, right? So, and there, we have some literature out there right now in this regard about the importance of nutrition, but you guys can definitely see why good nutrition, right, and avoiding things like alcohol and excessive caffeine after concussion can definitely be advised, because we have this essentially inverted metabolic demand where you have an initial influx of glucose, and then glucose actually falls below normal, right? And then it actually persists that way for nearly the first week, at least in most people. And these timelines, guys, are obviously very malleable. This is just an example. Okay, so you can also see how obviously that inflow of potassium and calcium creates essentially a positive, ion balance and overload inside of the cell, and can cause a state of toxicity and inflammation, right? Now, what do you guys think, by the way? Okay, going back to our example of secondary cell death. Okay, if we have a neuron that has increased metabolic demand and a decreased level of glucose inside of that cell, okay, what will happen over time, right, if those metabolic demands are not met? What will happen to the cell? Any ideas?
It's gonna die.
Okay, thank you, Bella. It's gonna die. All right. Okay. Nice job. Woo. Okay, here's the deal. All right, so we have this, we have this, essentially these correlates, right? between, essentially these chemical influx, this influx of chemicals and neurotransmitters, bless you, Maddie, and symptoms. Yeah. And obviously symptoms, right? So obviously, at least this is how Giza tends to think about this and conceptualize it, right? So this initial ionic flux, right, can obviously lead us into things like migraine and photophobia, so really bad headache, noise sensitivity, right? And obviously, we can have continued, obviously a continued energy crisis that can result in secondary injury, right? So obviously continued cell death and metabolic imbalance. Now, okay, what do you guys think? Okay, so let's kind of think about this for a second. We have axonal injuries. So axons tend to stretch and maybe even the fibers within those axons tear, right? How do you think having an axon that might be stretched or maybe even have, small tears within that axonal fiber, how do you think that would affect your ability to transmit messages and transmit signals between neurons? Would it increase? Would it decrease the ability, or would it stay the same?
Decrease.
Okay, is that Justine? Thank you. You said decrease, Justine, did I hear you right? Okay, cool. Yeah, absolutely, right? So it's going to decrease the obviously nerve conduction and the ability of the nerve to send messages, okay? And it's this concept, guys, of diffuse axonal injury, okay, on a metabolic level that we think contributes to altered cognition, okay, slowed processing, and slowed reaction time, okay? This is why we think people have a hard time cognitively and don't really appear to be able to react to things as quickly and or, obviously also perform. What are you eating? Sorry, my dog just ate parts Kong last night. And so we're just waiting for that to show up somewhere later. Weirdo. So anyway, but yeah, so this diffuse axonal injury, has obviously been linked to, or been, purported to be linked to obviously decreased cognition, reaction time, and processing speed. Okay, and over time, right, as a secondary injury continues to propagate, right, throughout that neuron, we can potentially even develop chronic symptoms and persistent symptoms. Okay, here's the deal though, guys. What does this mean for us from a clinical perspective? Okay, generally speaking, if we're going to look at how these injuries happen, right, we need to be able to divide up. Okay, we need to be able to divide up these impacts and conceptualize these as concussive versus subconcussive. Okay, so who can tell me, and maybe you've seen this clinically already, and if you have, that's amazing, right? Who has seen a concussion caused by subconcussive blows, or someone that's had symptoms after subconcussive blows? What did that look like? If anyone has seen it.
By subconcussive blows, do you mean like less impactful blows?
Yes.
So
clarifying. So low level blows that take place over time. A classic example of this is, let's say we have an offensive lineman. Okay, it's the best example that we got. An offensive lineman, and while they're not entirely, taking high level impacts, all the time, they do every single play, make helmet to helmet contact with a defensive lineman at a low level, right? And that buildup of those small impacts over time, right, can actually cause symptoms in the long run. We've definitely seen that, right? That's happened. Has anybody ever seen anything like that? No?
I mean, I've experienced it.
You have? Okay. Were you okay, and so Josh, if you don't mind me asking, did you play football in high school?
Yep, I played high school football. I played 1 year of college football.
Okay. You lineman?
I played defensive line.
Okay. So Josh, you said that you've experienced that. Okay. Super relevant question that'll I think really drive home this point. How many times after a normal game for you or a normal practice did you walk into the locker room after practice with a headache?
I mean, probably like once a week. And then
Okay.
what was it? Because I mean, like, it just all kind of compiled into like, it was like one of those days where I just kept on getting hit in the head. Like, I probably got hit in the head like 20 plus times in the practice. And I just kind of blacked out for part of the practice. And then afterwards, I just emailed Troy and came in the morning and he's like, yeah, you're not okay.
Okay. And so, and obviously, you know, comparatively, right, if we look at that and we compare that to one high energy blow over time that causes symptoms, hey, that is a concussive impact, as opposed to what Josh told us. You know, he took maybe 20 impacts, you know, that day at practice that were relatively low level, but that those ultimately resulted in symptoms, right? So that's the difference between between a concussive blow and a subconcussive blow. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, perfect. I want to make sure that we were kind of driving that point home and that made sense to everybody. All right, so guys, believe it or not, okay, I'm gonna give you guys time to process. We're gonna stop here today. Okay, we're gonna cover the rest of this tomorrow. And quick heads up, I'm not sure yet, but I've got to potentially meet with a prospective student on Friday after Tech 1. So what that means is that we may be in person on Friday. I don't know yet. Okay, if we are, I will let you know. Okay, I've got to figure that out still, but we may actually be together in person on Friday. Okay, just depends on this student and when they can meet and if that works for me as far as being able to get to campus, right? So.
Hey, Wade,
Yo,
can I ask what you mean by prospective student?
I'm just someone that has interest in athletic training and wants to learn more about the program. Well, I mean, yeah, we have these meetings like several times a year. So essentially what happens is a person applies to Gustavus and says that they have an interest in athletic training. And so the admissions team essentially sets up a meeting with either Mary or myself to talk about the major.
Yeah, but aren't we like not taking another class next year?
See, you're right. And ultimately, the way that we're essentially handling that right now is we're telling them that we have plans, right, to obviously continue with a master's. This is what it looks like. And if we get approved, we'd love to have you come to Gustavus and be an athletic training student. Yep. So that's essentially how we're handling it. Kind of TBA, but we tell them about how great athletic training is and smile real big and hope that they pick us. So that's essentially how that goes. But anyway, any other questions before we sign off for this morning? Okay. All right. So we'll pick up the second half of this tomorrow/Friday. I will keep you guys posted as soon as I know what's going to be happening. I'll let you guys know, and we'll plan on meeting probably in the classroom on Friday because there's nobody up there on Friday mornings during our time. Okay. All right. You guys rock my socks off. All right. I will see you tomorrow. Okay. If you need anything, let me know.
Thanks, Wade.
Bye, guys.